Alright, today's topic is the Roman Empire, with your goal for you to be able to describe the governance, life, and technological achievements of the Roman Empire as we are moving on from the Republic. Our previous notes covered the period of the Roman Republic right here, and in class we talked about the crumbling and eventual collapse of the Republic and rise of Julius Caesar, who was assassinated. Then there will be a civil war, which will then mark the beginning of the period of the Roman Empire, which will be the reuniting of what was once the Roman Republic under the rule of Julius Caesar's adopted son, Augustus, the very first Roman emperor. We'll get into more of whether he was a good ruler or not in our next class, but for now, we're going to take a look at what was life like during this period of the Roman Empire. Our first key question of today's notes is, how did the switch from the Republic to Empire change the Roman government? Hopefully you remember from a previous lesson that the Roman Republic was a democracy where people would vote for laws and members of the Senate in the assembly. Well, once we're in the full-on empire phase, the early emperors tried to maintain this illusion that Rome was still a republic and that the people still held on to the power. But ultimately, the emperors were the ones in charge. The Senate still existed, but didn't really have any power at this point. Starting under Augustus, many of the emperors reorganized the empire to be more efficient so that things just worked better within the empire. They had paid administrators handling tax collection, postal systems, census of everything. The legal traditions of the 12 tables that we talked about in the previous lesson slowly kind of transition and evolve into just imperial laws created not by the Senate or the people, but by the edicts of the emperors themselves. Essentially, what you start seeing is power being taken away from the people, away from their elected representatives, and be consolidated into a single person, the Roman emperor. As the empire expanded in size, different areas of the empire were divided up into what we call provinces, ruled over by appointed governors to look over the local populations, make sure the laws were enforced, and secure the borders with the Roman legions. They follow a very similar model to what we saw in the earlier Persian Empire. After the assassination of Julius Caesar, Augustus fights a civil war that reunites the Republic under his control. This event marks the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. It's also a period that historians look back on called the Pax Romana, a 200-year period of relative peace and stability within the empire. It's during this time that the Mediterranean Sea gets united under the control of the Romans and turned into what they called a private Roman lake as their empire expanded completely around the Mediterranean Sea. Augustus added areas like Egypt, Judea, started the conquest of Britannia as well, and pushed their borders further up to the Danube River, bordering the Germanic tribes. Later emperors, near the end of the Pax Romana, would add Mesopotamia and other regions to the Roman Empire, completing the enveloping of the Mediterranean Sea, and the population of Rome, the empire itself, will grow to about 80 million, with the population of the city of Rome reaching around 1 million. The empire reached such a size that traveling across the empire actually took quite a bit of time. It would take about 2 to 3 weeks to get from Rome to Britannia's capital, Londinium, about the same amount of time to get to Alexandria or Jerusalem. It would take even longer to get to Constantinople because traveling by land took a lot longer than traveling by sea. This is going to create problems that we'll be looking at in a future lesson. During the Pax Romana, we have the period known as the Five Good Emperors. Now, these are emperors who were chosen by their ability rather than their bloodline. That means, essentially, they were chosen to be emperors because they were good at doing their job, not because of who their daddies were. Now, I'm not going to make you memorize the names of these emperors, but I am giving them to you here with the years, just so you have some context. They were all within the first 200 years of the empire's existence, so that within the Pax Romana period. And while Augustus starts the Pax Romana, it really is these 5 emperors that keep this peace and stability going through wise governance and expansion, and really pushing Rome to the peak of its power. The final of the good emperors was a man named Marcus Aurelius here, who's actually a devout student of the Greek philosophy of Stoicism that we talked about in the previous unit. However, his death marks the beginning of the crumbling of the empire, which will take several centuries to complete before the Western Empire completely collapses. So let's talk about everyone else. What was life like for the common people of the empire? Now, life pretty much continued for many just the way it had. Patricians and plebeians still were a thing, with the wealthiest of the patricians being able to afford private mansions that they called villas out in the countryside. They also had some influence over the government and held very high public offices, some of them being able to achieve the level of governors in the Roman provinces. For the plebeians, many of them were small farmers out in the countryside if they could just do subsistence farming, basically growing enough food just to survive. A lot of the bigger farms were owned by the wealthy patricians, and plebeians, if they lived in the city, well, they were the merchants, the workers, and they lived in basically apartment structures. So, in many ways, the Roman civilization is very much a modern civilization with wealthy people living out in the rural countryside area in giant private mansions, and everyone else kind of living close together in the city in apartments and things like that, just trying to get by. It's estimated that about 30 to 40% of the population of the entire empire was actually made up by people who were enslaved. Slavery was a core part of Roman civilization. They conquered new areas and brought people back as slaves in order to do a lot of the construction work, to work on the large plantation farms, and things like that. Women, on the other hand, they were generally managing households and gained some influence in society, especially at the highest patrician and elite level, or the empresses, the wives of the emperors. So you start seeing women gaining some power and some influence in the Roman Empire as well. Now, with a population of about 1 million people living within the city of Rome, it can get a little tricky for the rulers. After all, you don't want them realizing that they're no longer citizens of a free republic and are now subjects of an empire. So the imperial solution to this was that the emperors would give out free food, usually wheat grain to make bread with, and they would have giant festivals with sporting events that you could go to for free as well. This way, people's bellies were full and their minds were distracted. This turns out to be a great strategy for controlling a population. Religiously, they continued to worship Greek gods that just using Latin names, so Zeus becomes Jupiter and so on and so forth. But a new addition to this was that upon the death of an emperor, the Senate would vote to make them gods themselves. This was a process known as apotheosis. So essentially, when an emperor died, the Senate would vote and say, yep, this emperor isn't dead, they just became a god. And as a polytheistic culture, they're pretty tolerant of other religions as long as you participated in imperial festivals and the worship of past emperors who have now become gods. In fact, they adopted many gods. Isis was worshipped from the Egyptian pantheon. Mithras, from a Persian god for warriors, was being worshipped, a popular cult. And from the Greeks, they adopted the Eleusinian Mysteries. Now, the Eleusinian Mysteries was a cult, and not the extremist type version that you think of cult today, but it was a religious group that said that they knew the secrets to get into basically paradise in the afterworld. Now, Romans, like Greeks, generally believed that when you died, you went to the Asphodel Meadows, this very boring, dreary place that your soul wanders for all eternity. But Elysium was this paradise level of the afterlife that if you knew the right words, right, you knew the right rituals, when you died, you could go to that paradise instead. You can see Romans adopting Persian gods, Egyptian gods, Greek mysteries, showing that, again, they were very tolerant of other religious beliefs. However, Judaism was a little bit different because that was a monotheistic faith, Christianity becoming an outgrowth of this as well. The Hebrew people, well, they worshiped one God, so they weren't going to worship the dead emperors as gods, and this kind of created a problem for the Roman emperors. It was seen as a challenge to their authority and their power over the empire. So the Hebrew people over here in Judea, the Israelite kingdoms that we talked about way back in the Bronze Age, they've rebelled against Roman rule multiple times, and then finally in the year 70 Common Era, an emperor named Vespasian puts down the rebellion for good, destroys the Jewish temple, and begins a period known as the Jewish diaspora. Essentially, the Jewish diaspora is when the Jewish people who are mostly living in Judea, the Roman province of Judea at this time, after the destruction of their temple in the city of Jerusalem, they spread out following Roman roads and trade routes across the Roman Empire and settled throughout Europe. It is their ancestors who are the ones who are going to be the victims of the Holocaust during World War II. And trade in the economy is humming along because of this 200-year period of peace. There was a standardized currency known as the denarius, these coins, which we're going to be looking at some of them in class, to make trade very easy because everyone accepted the same coins as currency. The army, as they marched on, conquering new areas, would build roads and protect trade routes, which would make trading safe and profitable across the empire. And Egypt became a lifeline for Rome because they grew a lot of grain there, a lot of wheat, which could be shipped into the empire that could then be used to give away free food in Rome for their bread and circuses. And these trade routes actually extended far beyond the borders of the empire, right? They went far south down here to a kingdom known as Aksum eventually, which we're going to be talking about when we get to our Africa unit. It even connects to the Silk Road, which will travel as far east as China. So there is trade between the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty in China, which we'll get to in a later unit. And then you also see that by sea, this is what we call the monsoon marketplace. They're also connected to the kingdoms and dynasties in India that are setting up shop. So we're seeing here this global economic system that's starting to develop again, right? Like we saw during the ends of the Bronze Age, we're now seeing this kind of connection to even a wider world between the Mediterranean world and as far east as China. As we alluded to, entertainment was a core way that the Roman Empire kept control of their people. So let's take a look at some of the things that people enjoyed for entertainment during the Roman Empire. Now, you're probably already aware that there were gladiator games, and these were the most popular entertainment in the Roman Empire. And in these, you'd have enslaved people fighting each other to the death. However, that was not the whole story. They would also be used for wild animal hunts, and in those fights to the death with other gladiators as the main event, usually no one died. Generally, they would fight until one of them had the upper hand and had the ability to kill the other one. But if they killed the other gladiator, then the owner of that gladiator would have to be compensated for their losses. So instead, generally they would fight till the very end where one was about to kill the other one, and then the fight would stop. An even more deadly and brutal form of combat was chariot races, which was like NASCAR today, except for with a much higher mortality rate. People died all the time because these races were so dangerous. And like gladiator fights, many of the chariot racers were actually enslaved people. But Romans also enjoyed theater performances, and many of these plays were based on Greek original plays. You can see this theater they constructed here. So this was right here where the people would be performing, and you can see all the people that could fit in this giant stadium. And sometimes, if a character died in the play, they would swap out the actor for a convicted criminal who was sentenced to death, and they would execute the criminal on the stage in the place of the actor to give the performances a little more flair. Now, Romans were also famous for their public festivals and holidays. They had over 150 of them every year to celebrate Roman gods, military victories, and imperial birthdays. These festivals would have free food and free sporting events to entertain the people, right? That bread and circus to keep them distracted. One of the most popular of this was the Festival of Saturnalia, which would be celebrated from December 17th to December 23rd, and a lot of their customs, and especially the timing of it, would eventually be adopted by later Christians and incorporated into the celebration of Christmas. Alright, let's take a look at what some of the technological achievements of the Roman Empire was. What made them so impressive? The first category of technology that we're going to explore is their infrastructure. That is the day-to-day things that you need to keep an empire or a civilization running. At the core of this was their aqueducts that helps Romans stand apart from other civilizations. Aqueducts carried fresh water up to 80 miles away using gravity to provide clean drinking water for the Roman cities. You can see a diagram here of how it works. So you see the water source right here, and what they would do is they would tunnel through mountains. They would have bridges built so that they could keep the water at an exact angle the entire distance, so the water would end up exactly where they want. They had distribution centers inside the city itself. They had even piping that went to private houses, so many wealthy homes had their own running water. And you can see even as they're tunneling through mountains, they'd have inspection shafts and settling tanks so that they can inspect the water in case there's a problem, but also to settle all that, any debris that might be coming through, like dirt or anything, so it'd settle down, so the water would be clean by the time it got to the city. And you can see these are giant construction projects. And instead of building a giant wall across the valley, they would actually use this arch system to save on building material and allow people to pass through it, which was again another innovation in the Romans. And of course, there were their roads. They had over 250,000 miles of roads that they built across their empire by their soldiers. These roads were layered and slightly curved so there'd be drainage so that even when you're walking on the roads, you wouldn't be walking through puddles if it had just rained. Some of these roads are still in use today. Those aqueducts would also be supplying water to the public baths that were built in Roman cities. Now, some of these were even heated by underground furnaces to create hot baths, and these spaces were used for hygiene, for cleaning yourselves, for exercise, shopping centers, socializing. People would just come and hang out. The largest of these things could hold 3,000 people bathing at the exact same time, with the daily attendance reaching as high as 10,000 people a day. Yeah, that's right, 3,000 people bathing in the same pool at the same time. Romans didn't have the same hang-up about nudity that we have in modern society. Here in this diagram, you can see how it works, right? So you have the aqueduct pouring into a cistern, which then connects to a water pipe system, which then goes into the baths, which you see here. Underneath the baths, you have these brick furnaces, which would be used to heat the heated baths, and there'd also be cold water baths, and then the pipe system, which would be the drainage for these bath complexes. This is a restoration of one of the bath complexes that's still standing, so you can see that they've updated the windows and things like this, but essentially it would look very similar to this in ancient times. It would be much more painted and colorful as well, but you get the idea. As we talked about, Romans were famous for their entertainment and using this to distract the populations. Now, chariot races were one of their favorite forms of entertainment, and they built a giant race complex known as the Circus Maximus, and the Circus Maximus could hold up to 150,000 people at once. At the center of it, you'd see this line right here. This is what they're racing around. These would have giant monuments that were taken from all the peoples that they've conquered, and they would take the statues, obelisks, or other stone things, and they would use them as trophies they'd place in the center of the Circus Maximus. So as the chariot racers were racing around and dying in these races, the people would also be reminded of the glory of Roman conquests. And then, of course, there's the Flavian Amphitheater, also known as the Colosseum to a lot of people. Its actual name is the Flavian Amphitheater. It was built, of course, for gladiator fights, and what some people don't know is that actually it was connected to the aqueduct and drainage sewage systems so that it could be flooded at a moment's notice so they could recreate naval battles within the Colosseum itself. It could hold up to 80,000 people at once, so not quite as much as the Circus Maximus, but that's a lot of people. It also had a retractable roof so that on hot sunny days you could get some shade for people, and had public bathrooms with running water for all 87,000 people. And below the Colosseum, it actually went further. There were several floors where gladiators and other animals would be held before their fight. It even had an elevator system that used pulleys so that they could have trapdoors open and they could raise the warriors or animals from the floor and just have them appear inside the Colosseum for their fights. And even more impressive, this area was designed to be flooded for those naval battles. That's right, because if they're going to flood the Colosseum, at least the floor of it, where they're going to have the naval battles, all the underground structure had to be built so that it could get wet and flooded and then drained out when they wanted to go back to having land-based battles inside the Colosseum. You have to hand it to the Romans. These engineers knew what they were doing. And then I gotta talk about the Pantheon. This was a temple built to honor all the Roman gods. The word Pantheon itself, the name of the building, just means all the gods. So it was supposed to be a temple for the worship of all the gods of the Roman Empire. Now, there were many temples across the empire, but what made the Pantheon so special was that it had the largest freestanding concrete dome ever built. Even today, we've not built a concrete dome that's freestanding bigger than this one. At its center was a hole called the oculus that would allow light to come in to illuminate the entire space. And if it rained, there were drains on the floor connected to the sewer systems to pour all that water out. The dome itself was 142 feet in diameter and 142 feet high. It actually formed a perfect sphere. And it's actually the inspiration for American government buildings like the U.S. Capitol building today. Ultimately, all of this Roman technology and engineering and spectacle, it was all both meant to be functional, that means to serve a purpose within the empire, but also to be propaganda to glorify the Roman power. So everyone was like, look, we may not have a democracy anymore, we may not be a republic anymore, but look at all these great things. We have free entertainment, we have all this glory that is Rome, we have free food, we have everything we need. We don't need democracy, we don't need to vote, as long as we have all this. All right, that's today's lesson. So as always, rewrite that goal. Give me those 3 important facts that you learned today, and give me one question you still have to show me that intellectual curiosity. All right, we'll see you in class when we talk about Augustus.